Hi, Dr. Bradley Jersak here from St. Stephen's University. Today I'm going to be walking you through a lesson from our course, A Quest for Meaning, Readings in Existentialism. And our focus today will be on contesting our faith. Really, this lesson comes in two parts, one from Friedrich Nietzsche and two from Søren Kierkegaard. Both of these men are called existentialists in retrospect, although that's a 20th century term. But in reality, they were both European prophetic critics of the Christendom of their day, of moralism, and especially of modernity itself. And so there is a sense in which they are the fathers of existentialism, along with the Russian author, Fyodor Dostoevsky. And they really are precursors to postmodernity. They're critiquing modernity in a way that challenges the status quo of their day and in the incredible, what would be a word they use, mediocrity of both the church and their society. So we'll begin with Nietzsche, who wants us to try our faith by losing it. Later, we'll refer to Kierkegaard, who wants us to find our faith by trying it. So Nietzsche, of course, lived in Germany, and he also taught for a while in Switzerland and Basel. He would have traveled as a bit of a philosophical vagabond around Europe. And there's a lot to be said about him, a lot to be read by him. He's most famous for the phrase, "God is dead," which he didn't actually coin, but nevertheless, he embeds it in the context of sort of a vision that he describes in his book, Thus Spake Zarathustra. And in that vision, he sees a madman coming out into the streets with a lantern. And he sees sort of the herd there, the status quo kind of mindless last man, he calls them. And he's frustrated with them. And he says, "God is dead, and you've killed him." And there's this sense in which they just don't get it. And the madman throws down his lantern and he shatters it in the streets. And he says, you won't get it, but one day there will be those who do. And so there's a lot more going on here than just sort of a confession of atheism. He's describing the way that God has died in even the context of European Christendom and the disasters that will follow from that. Now, as it concerns this lesson, I want to zero in on a thought experiment that he called Christians to do, because he felt that if we wanted to be serious about our faith, we needed to really test it. And his way of testing it was by voluntarily losing it, at least for a time. And I want to walk you through the elements of his test, because they're very relevant to deconstruction kind of rhetoric today. And I also want to critique his test. Further, I want to run his test through somebody who perhaps lived it in a sense, and that is our diatoma, our great saint, Simone Weil, the French philosopher mystic from the early 20th century. So let's begin with Friedrich Nietzsche's God is Dead test. And he says this in his book, Daybreak. These serious, excellent, upright, deeply sensitive people who are still Christians from the very heart, they owe it to themselves to try for once the experiment of living for some length of time without Christianity. They owe it to their faith in this way for once to sojourn in the wilderness, if only to win for themselves the right to voice on the question whether Christianity is necessary. And so he's imagining a sort of serious Christian that still has a heart faith, and I believe he would have been very skeptical about that. But for those who see them that way, he wants to call them to this kind of test where they set aside Christianity. My friend and mentor, Lucy Huskinson, a Nietzsche scholar from Bangor University, who supervised my PhD thesis, along with Ron Dart, wrote an incredible introduction to Nietzsche. It's really worth coming into Nietzsche with a bit of a guide so that you don't get lost in his rhetoric. If you want a very accessible, beautifully written little guide that is specific even to Christian readers. Lucy's book is remarkable because she's not just a fangirl of Nietzsche, nor is she an incredible critic. She sees value in what he's doing, and so she comes as a sympathetic ear to try to communicate to Christians how Nietzsche perhaps thought he was saving us from ourselves. She says in her book, Nietzsche thinks Christians are not only deluding themselves into thinking that life is simply a waiting room for a free ticket away from suffering, they're also offending humanity in the process. Our human life, Nietzsche says, is something to celebrate and own, and this includes its every struggle and pain. Nietzsche calls us out of the waiting room and into the wilderness to confront our suffering and, as we saw earlier, to test ourselves and to force us into learning how to become spiritually stronger and self-sufficient. The Christian who fails to take responsibility for his or her suffering will not only live a sick and stagnant life, but will also create injustice through their resultant ressentiment, which is like resentment. And I think that what she's nailing down there really is a critical problem today. And we have, in fact, spent much of the 20th century, at least in the Western Christian church, sort of treating life as a waiting room, and salvation is this free ticket out of suffering into some heavenly afterlife. And that's really, it's true. That discredits humanity. It's very dehumanizing in that sense. And so he calls us to test our faith, to make sure that what we believe and what we live are congruent and life-giving. Lucy continues, Nietzsche's writings call upon us to test ourselves in order to ascertain whether the way we fashion our lives enables us to realize our potential, and whether our beliefs are in the service of our lives or dictate our lives to us. The death of God provides a superb test condition to assess the strength of a Christian's faith. Nietzsche describes the test of Christian faith as the needful sacrifice. So let's first of all talk about the context of this test. And he uses the words a wilderness sojourn. What does he mean by that? Well, for Nietzsche, the necessary context of this test must be a wilderness trial, a confrontation with suffering and the horrors of life. So you don't get to just sit in your little waiting chamber, in your cultural little fortress, where you join your Christian club and don't face into the suffering and horrors of life, either on the outside or on the inside. Now, I see some limitations to this kind of context. First of all, he describes the wilderness sojourn as if this were an experimental suffering that is chosen or willed. And I wonder if that's actually how we experience suffering and the horrors of this life. Is it something we choose? Do we step into it on purpose? Do we will this to happen? And if we can turn it on and then turn it off again, perhaps we're not entering the truest afflictions of the human condition. Maybe we're just playing. Maybe that's coming from a place of privilege. Second, he assumes that faith in such a wilderness is voluntarily embraced or relinquished, as if I have a choice about that. Is affliction generally chosen? Or is it something that comes upon us that we undergo? And so this leads to a question, to what degree are affliction or faith a matter of the will at all? So if we think about this wilderness sojourn, and whether it's something we can enter into voluntarily, I do think of Simone Weil. There is a possibility that you could live this thought experiment in real life under certain conditions. And I see these conditions, these possibilities in the life of Simone Weil. First, one could voluntarily descend into the darkness of the fray if you hold to an ideological conviction. So, for example, in the case of Simone Weil, she was an avid anti-fascist. And in that conviction, she felt compelled to go participate in the Spanish Civil War. And so she enters the darkness of that civil war, of the death around her, of the suffering that it caused, and she endured true affliction. And she did, in fact, choose it, but she chose it out of ideological convictions that compelled her. Second, you could voluntarily enter this kind of suffering by standing in solidarity as an advocate among an oppressed people group that suffers involuntarily. So their suffering might be involuntary, but I can choose to enter into it. I can choose to stand in solidarity and enter their world and suffer it with them through co-suffering love. And so an example of this would be her concern for the factory workers and the labor movement who were really being crushed in France under industry and these horrendously dangerous factories and the terrible pace of piecework that they're expected to do. So in solidarity, she quits her teaching job and she chooses to go work in the Renault factory for a year. The truth is she did get to check out of there after a year, but that was only because she could no longer stand the migraines that were inflicting her. And also she had some near-death experiences there just with her awkwardness and big machinery. But in any case, standing in solidarity on purpose, willingly, did really bring her into an experience of affliction. Third, when we're faced with life and death danger, we may have an option to flee. And in those moments when we don't flee, we can voluntarily choose this wilderness kind of space. And so Simone Weil lived in France during the Nazi occupation, and she could have fled much earlier, but she joins the resistance. She goes down to Marseille, and in fact, she doesn't leave France until she realizes she needs to get her parents out of there safely. It's only then that she crosses over, leaves them in New York City, moves on to England, and has an opportunity in her mind to go rejoin the resistance and enter back into France during the occupation. But her attempts to do that were actually stymied by the leadership of the resistance movement. So here's 3 examples or possibilities for how you might take this wilderness sojourn on purpose, willingly, as a free choice, and yet experience it as authentic. And so that's the context of the test. Now the condition of the test. When you go into this wilderness, Nietzsche says you need to learn how to live without Christianity. So you're going to set aside your faith. That's a necessary condition to try your faith, is that you have to live without it. You have to lose it. You set aside your Christianity. Presumably, if one can live for a time as if God is dead, one might discover whether their Christian faith is genuine or necessary or not. The condition of the test is rather loaded with assumptions, and it does beg certain questions that I'd like to ask here. But that's the condition, to live as if God is dead for a time. Live without your faith. So I'm going to begin by pushing back. How would you live without Christianity? Some of the criteria are possible. Some I'm not so sure. So first of all, you could live without Christianity by abandoning Christian ritual. In other words, you could stop praying. You could stop reading your Bible. You could stop taking times of meditation. You could look through the rituals of your Christian life, your participation in the Eucharist, your participation in personal devotional practice, and you could set that aside. That's actually possible. You could fast from that. Second, he's calling us to abandon Christian fellowship. Now, that might not be so easy. I guess I could stop going to church, but what if my world is made up of people of faith, or at least some of them? Am I now going to abandon my family and my friends if they still have faith? Am I going to walk away from all Christian fellowship? Well, easy for him to say. Not so easy for those who live in the context of Christian community. For them to leave that fellowship would be deeply traumatizing, and it would be a kind of rejection that is pretty intense if you're doing it as a faith experiment. But nevertheless, we do have people doing that. They get sick of Christianity, and in their deconstruction, they walk away not only from church, but from anybody who reminds them of it. And so, yes, this is possible. You might want to consider the cost of doing that for a time, lest you not be able to re-enter those connections, but you're going to then have to almost act as if they're dead to you. And he says, so you should. Now it gets a little trickier. He's also calling us to abandon Christian ethics. Isn't that part of Christianity, our ethical system? Now, which ethics are you going to abandon? Will we say, for a time you need to live without love? And what else would be a Christian ethic? Oh, compassion. Let's live without compassion now. And probably empathy. We can't have empathy, can we? Now, on the one hand, he's really pushing against the sort of moralism that was strangling people like him in the church. But to set aside Christianity along with its ethics, that seems very dehumanizing if we're going to talk about it that way. Yes, you could go sort of from a Victorian prudishness to the party life, and I guess you could go off and exploit sex trade workers and get syphilis like he did. Is that the kind of Christian ethics we want to abandon? At what point are our Christian ethics actually human ethics? Because the humanist ethics that we value most actually were rooted in Jesus Christ. And the father of modern humanism was Erasmus, who was a Christian. And so maybe you could do a sort of secular humanism, but it's a little tricky about what laying aside your ethics means. And finally, can you even abandon Christian faith? Now, if faith is just sort of a set of ideas that I signed off on, sure. Exchange one set of ideas for another. But is that faith? Can you stop believing what you actually believe? Can you pretend to yourself that you don't believe it? Or maybe there are those who are deconstructing who find it now impossible to believe what they were once expected to. Well, then this could possibly work for you. You just let go of maybe what you were strenuously clinging to, and maybe you already did. Now, there are some possibilities around this in terms of living without Christianity, and again, I turn to Simone Weil. She didn't just talk deconstruction, she talked decreation, and for her, she wanted to decreate the ego, and she wanted to decreate spirituality, and she wanted to decreate every construct of God that could be a projection from me. And she leaves us now saying, like, we're not even going to pursue God, but what we will do is we will be in a posture of attentive waiting. So here's some ways that she practiced this. And she's not doing this because Nietzsche told her to. In fact, while I see her writing in response to Nietzsche all the time, she won't even dignify with using his name or talking about his movement. So I think she had some real disdain for him. And yet you see these parallels. She did fast from Christian projections. She wanted to make sure that any ideas she had about God were those that she received in attentive waiting, not that she made up on her own or even in any church. And so she was very resistant to the kind of idolatry of God that arises in a human ego or in a church system. You fast from all Christian projections. You also fast from Christian pursuit. So this would be like no striving allowed. You don't get to grasp at God or you're going to create an idol. You have to wait. And so she saw her sense of faith as it was active in the sense of activism, but in terms of God, it was very passive. He's going to need to come find me. And in fact, he did. And then finally, you might also fast from Christian prayer. And so she felt like silent attention is enough. And she was very worried that even the words of her prayers could become projections, could create idols. And so she was super nervous about using prayer and even about reading the mystics in their lives. She thought, you know what, I don't want to be influenced by that at all. So she's really paring down her faith into this kind of attentive waiting. And it is, in a sense, living without Christianity as dictated by Christendom, the Christianity of dogma, the Christianity of creeds, the Christianity of churchianity, and so on. And so she tries her faith in that way. And what's so beautiful about it is she said, you know, if I have to choose the truth over Christ, I'll choose truth. And here's why. Because if I pursue the truth, I will inevitably, very quickly, fall into his arms. And so she did. Back to Lucy. We move on now to the consequences of the test. So we've had the context of the test, the wilderness, sojourn. We've had the conditions of the test, setting aside your Christianity for a time. And now what will be the consequences? Dr. Huskinson puts it this way. Nietzsche is in effect calling Christians to assess both the value and limits of their faith by sacrificing it in order to see whether it is strong enough to return. Such a sacrifice can occur only in the solitude of wilderness, which is to say, when the person is confronted with the suffering and horror of life. The test is to see whether the person can joyfully affirm his or her suffering as part of a blessed life and wish its eternal recurrence. Or, by contrast, either wish for his or her escape from it by seeking comfort in a compassionate God, or feel the need to belittle it by regarding it as a means to a higher end, such as divine retribution. So that's interesting. He seems to think that suffering is meant to be endured as part of the blessed life. And that kind of makes sense because as we face and overcome suffering, we discover meaning in life. That's very, very existentialist of him. And in fact, both he and Simone Weil really were drawn to this Stoic idea of amor fati, love of fate. In other words, it's sort of practicing acceptance of what is, instead of trying to force the human experience into one of heavenly bliss. It's like, no, you lean into the suffering, you experience, you undergo it, and you even see it as part of the blessings of life. But on the other hand, Nietzsche looks at that and he says, but maybe you can't do that. Maybe you just want to escape by seeking comfort in a compassionate God. And that really offends him. He thinks that's very life negating to seek comfort in a compassionate God. Well, really? I don't know. How do you even answer that? Don't we want compassion and need compassion? Doesn't God offer compassion? Doesn't that help us in our suffering? Isn't that part of making suffering not only endurable, but may even give it some meaning? Or maybe they feel the need to belittle their suffering. I really understand this because we get in this terrible habit of saying, well, I'm suffering, therefore what? There must be a lesson, or this must be a punishment, or somehow like you blame it on God as if the suffering is unto some greater thing, when sometimes suffering is just suffering. As Weil will say, it is what it is. So these are consequences of the test. She continues, if Christians can endure the former, the suffering, without recourse, to the compassion of God or to a denial of the suffering, then they have successfully lived without recourse to their God and can subsequently pass judgment on whether Christianity is necessary for the living of their life. If they still maintain it is indeed necessary, their faith will subsequently be reborn in a strengthened form, as a genuine and more serious faith. If it is not strong enough to return, they are released from an unnecessary restraint on the living of their lives. Now, to me, it sounds like he's just setting up a double bind. It's sort of like this. If you need it, it's a pathetic crutch, so toss the crutch and learn how to live. If you don't need it, toss the worthless crutch away because you don't need it. So in any case, it's like whether you discover that you can live without Christianity or not, you should live without it. I know he's not saying it that directly, but that's what I'm reading between the lines. On the other hand, Simone Weil does this. And what she discovers is that she does need her Christianity, and she sees Christianity as the religion of slaves. Now, that was Nietzsche's critique. The problem with Christianity is it's the religion of slaves, and it was this victim mentality. She comes along and says, actually, when I was down in Portugal at the seashore and I would listen to the women singing their songs of lament as their husbands went off potentially forever in the fishing boats and may never see them again if they get shipwrecked, and in any case for months at a time, and she hears the pain in it and she goes, in that moment I knew Christianity is the religion of slaves, and sign me up, because that's what we are. And so that's a direct rebuttal to Nietzsche's argument. And she says, we should never even think about Christianity and the cross outside of the crucifixion of 50,000 rebel slaves during the slave revolt in Rome, and just the massive horrors and the affliction. In that sense, she's leaning further into the affliction than Nietzsche was willing. So, the consequences. If I lay them out and I understand him right, he's saying some might have the courage to joyfully endure and affirm suffering without recourse to faith as part of life, in which case God is proven unnecessary. Some will be unable to endure affliction in their own strength, wishing only to fly back to God for consolation and reprieve, like Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. He says, actually, what we suffered was far beyond our ability to endure. And so he does come back to God for consolation and reprieve. And this is something Nietzsche would just despise. He would hold that kind of needy faith as in contempt. And then some will minimize suffering by looking beyond it or making sense of it through some redemptive or retributive outcome. And so, we see Paul in 2 Corinthians 4. We see Jesus in Hebrews 12. And these are like how suffering does actually come to some redemptive outcome for them. And shipwrecked, but not drowned, knocked down, but not knocked out. And every time they fall and get up again, we see a kind of victory. And so that does, in a sense, redeem suffering, but it's not the cause for suffering. We would not make God the cause or agent of our suffering for some sort of heavenly lesson. Get a better teacher then, if that's what you need to do. But in any case, redemption's a real thing for us. And through redemption, our suffering is co-opted into a kind of victory that transforms us. And now a very few may endure the suffering and earn the right to judge faith as still necessary, in which case faith may return in a purer and stronger form. Nietzsche does allow for that in a very few rare cases. Well, okay, fine. He calls those who can rise above ressentiment and face into the suffering with endurance and faithfulness, then they've earned the right to judge faith as necessary. And that's where it is Simone Weil, not Adolf Hitler, who becomes the fulfillment of Nietzsche's Übermensch, the Superman, the one who overcomes. All right, so I feel like Nietzsche actually does bring some fair concerns to the table. First, if our faith drives us into denial or into triumphalism, rather than taking up the cross that Christ has offered, it is toxic. Absolutely. And that is a toxin he was observing all the time in Christendom. And I think that's a fair concern, and perhaps even more so today than it was in his day, where Christianity has become, in many cases, a civil religion or a political club or part of the entertainment industry. And that's pathetic, and it's mediocre, and it's toxic. And we need to let Nietzsche take us by the throat on that and speak to us this stuff and actually condemn our denial, condemn our triumphalism, condemn the way we've politicized faith or treated as consumers who just want to be pleased with a good show. Let Nietzsche lean on you on this. Second, if our faith uses God to flee from life, as it is, into a Christian ghetto or some Gnostic super spirituality or pie in the sky, in the sweet by and by kind of denialism, then instead of affirming life and living life as Jesus did, it is worse than useless. So let Nietzsche really get in our face about that. Because in many cases, Christianity has once again become a little cultural ghetto, or we've treated it as what he called the waiting room. And maybe we're trying to escape from real life, even let's say in charismatic worship where we want to have some third heaven experience instead of like, wait a minute, what if loving your neighbor's really hard right now? What if reconciling with a friend or a family member isn't working so well? Will you pursue that? What if life is just hard, but that's okay? And what if you're meant to live it as it is? So I think I want to hear Nietzsche's fair concerns. I want to undergo Nietzsche instead of evade him. At the same time, there's some problematic assumptions in his test. Here's the ones I see. The ability or inability to sustain and embrace life without faith falsifies faith. But does it? What if I'm just like a comfortable upper middle class privileged person like him? And I don't need faith. And there, that proves faith is false. Really? Second, he assumes that faith's veracity, that means the truth of it, is tested by its usefulness. Is that something we can know before the resurrection? Because I'll tell you, it sure wasn't useful for the martyrs. Or was it? But that kind of, like, what's the practical benefits of following Jesus? Well, okay. It will lead you to the wilderness sojourn of suffering. So I suppose that's good, from a Nietzschean point of view. But that sounds very utilitarian to me. And I do want to say that following the Jesus way in God's good order actually is a beneficial way to live in general, but it is going to have challenges with it, because you know what? Stuff like enemy love and radical forgiveness aren't easy and sometimes not useful. Third, he assumes that faith is falsified by one's need to run to God for comfort. So if you need to run to God for comfort, therefore it's not valid. I don't get that. But Nietzsche does present a strong case for the need to examine the anemic faith among the Christian herd today. He's really a prophet of deconstruction that I think has earned our hearing. And so are we willing to hear Nietzsche's concerns, or shall we recoil in defensiveness? God's not dead. Well, okay. Or could we hear Nietzsche and risk examining ourselves to see whether we're just deluded or not? What if he actually provides a bit of a furnace to test our faith? Well, that sounded positive, didn't it? But I want to say this. For a more prudent approach in contesting faith, I believe, actually, Søren Kierkegaard is the wiser, more reliable, and even exacting inquisitor. And he's going to say, not try your faith by losing it, but find your faith by trying it, because he's not convinced we have. And so in our next lesson, we're going to look at Kierkegaard and his way of finding faith by trying it.